Okay, so I'm going to speak to you today about use of environmental sampling methods to find foot and mouth in the environment. Hopefully. Okay, so Bryony's actually introduced the topic quite nicely about how we use clinical surveillance to look at prevalence of foot and mouth and actually many other diseases. But this is not always the best way of doing it. We can often underestimate the prevalence of diseases if we're only looking for clinical cases. There's obviously asymptomatic cases and subclinical disease that would not be picked up by these types of surveillance. As with foot and mouth in particular, we know that when we have an infected animal, it sheds huge amounts of virus. So the environment around an infected animal is very easily contaminated. This graph on the slide here illustrates that quite nicely. So the blue line represents viral shedding from an infected animal. Obviously, we get large amounts of virus shed from the animal, but this is over a shorter period of time. The green line represents the amount of virus that is found in the environment around this infected animal. So while you have less virus that you can actually find, it's present in the environment for a lot longer. First of all, this represents a transmission risk because you have virus in the environment that could potentially cause transmission. But secondly, this presents the opportunity for us to be able to detect the virus, and obviously it's over a much longer period than we could detect the virus just by looking at four clinical cases. So 2 years ago, I presented work to you showing that we could get environmental transmission from a contaminated environment. This was all done in experimental studies at the Purbright Institute, and during these studies, we also developed methods that enabled us to detect foot and mouth from the environment. These experiments, however, were experiments. They were done under controlled conditions. So while we knew that we had methods that worked and that we could detect environmental foot and mouth, we obviously wanted to move this forward and see if we could detect foot and mouth in the real environment. This meant obviously going out into the field, and we went over to Nepal, which is endemic for foot and mouth, so that we could test out these methods with natural infections in the real world. So to give you a bit of a background about foot and mouth in Nepal, the most amount of farming is essentially subsistence farming. So families on their plots of lands will have their own houses and then several animals, so maybe a couple of cattle, some goats, maybe a few chickens running around as well, but there's never large numbers of animals all in one place. So we went onto farms where foot and mouth was confirmed, and we took samples from various environments around these farms. So our sampling method is intentionally simple. Because we wanted to create a sampling method that is not labor or expertise intensive. This sampling could be done by anyone who has a reasonable common sense level. So what we did is we took electrostatic dust cloths, and we essentially just swabbed surfaces which we deemed were most likely to have come into contact with either an infected animal or the secretions and excretions from an infected animal. So if, for example, we went onto a household and they had a cattle shed where they would keep their cows overnight, this would be an excellent place to swab. If they have places where they kept their animals tied up, so tether ropes and tether sticks, we would also swab those areas. All of these swabs were then eluted into media. The media then is our sample, and that was put into lysis buffer immediately at the point of sampling, and these samples were then shipped back to Purbright for testing. The transport in lysis buffer did mean that we could do no analysis using viable virus, so all of this is to do with PCR analysis. So as I said, we were sampling in Kathmandu. All of our samples were taken over 3 different trips in November 2016, April 2017, and November 2017. A total of 9 sites were visited, and this included a grand total of 24 different households that had foot and mouth confirmed. So our methods did work, which was very nice when we got back and tested the samples. So when we went onto the farms, we were obviously with experienced veterinarians, and they were able to confirm the presence of foot and mouth in the animals. And they also gave us an estimate of the lesion age of each of the animals that we were sampling from and around. So this data is the proportion of positive samples that we collected at each farm plotted against the lesion age of the animals that were infected on these farms. And this is the take-home message from this. Is basically throughout the whole phase of clinical disease, we can detect foot and mouth in the environment. So we're not restricted to just where you see the peak signs of clinical disease. We can detect it pre that and post that and during that. And just a couple of things to highlight on this. We had 2 farms that were essentially, there were no active cases of foot and mouth on these farms. So one of these farms was a suspected preclinical case. So there was a single cow with a high temperature, but no other obvious symptoms of foot and mouth. And we managed to detect foot and mouth in some of the environmental samples we collected there. And there was also a second farm, which was, again, had no active cases, but was next door to a farm that did have an active case. And again, we picked up foot and mouth in the environment there. On this end of the scale, we have cases that were essentially resolved by the time that we were sampling, so over 20 days. And at this point, obviously, the lesions in the animals are healing, so it's not necessarily easy to state just by looking at the animal that yes, foot and mouth was here, but we were able to detect foot and mouth in the samples here as well. So we get a broad spectrum of being able to detect foot and mouth from the environment. And finally, we also collected samples from a milk collection point. So this links quite nicely with Bryony's talk. So this was in a village where there was an ongoing outbreak of foot and mouth. No animals were kept at this point, but this is where villagers would bring their milk for a communal collection. We took 4 environmental swabs from here, and 1 of them turned out to be positive. So that was quite a nice representation of the fact you don't need animals to be present. You can just have animal products and you can still find foot and mouth in the environment. So what we wanted to do with some of our results is look and see if there was any way that we could, by looking at what our results were, improve our methods and find out where we were most likely to detect positive samples. So we can perhaps guide people to the most appropriate places where positive samples can be recovered from. So I mentioned that we would sample from inside cattle sheds. So as a preference, when we were doing our samples, we would rather take them from inside a sheltered area where we presumed that virus would A, be more concentrated, and B, have a better chance of survival than out in a big old courtyard where it was more likely to be degraded but also be much more dilute. And this held up with our results. We grouped them in various different surfaces that we had collected samples from. And generally, if we were collecting the samples from an inside area, we were more likely to detect a positive. I will just make an advert here for Emma Brown's poster. The abstract is on page 91 of your books. She's done some validation on our sampling methods, so please go and look at her poster if you're interested in this. So at the same time as doing the environmental sampling, we also looked at collecting aerosol samples. So the idea behind the environmental sampling and aerosol sampling is that it permits us to take essentially a herd level sampling rather than sampling from individual animals. So while we were in Nepal, we took various aerosol samples. We know that if you stick an aerosol sampler directly in front of an infected cow, you can detect foot and mouth in those samples. What we'd like to do, and to take this further, is to actually look at the sensitivity of this. So if you have larger numbers of animals and maybe only 1 or 2 of them infected, would you still be able to detect the virus from the herd rather than just individual animals? Unfortunately, the farming situation in Nepal didn't really permit us to do this, but it is something that would be of interest. Ideally, when you collect samples looking for a disease, it's good to be able to get an answer straight away if you have the disease or not. Obviously, in our study, we shipped our samples back to Pirbright, so the time to confirmation was quite long. But what we would like to be able to do is obviously use these in conjunction with pen-side tests so that once you've collected your samples, you can get an almost immediate answer. With environmental samples, the levels of virus are really quite low compared to clinical signs. So, clinical samples, sorry. So, things like lateral flow devices are just not sensitive enough and are not suitable for use with environmental samples. We did, however, have access to the T-Core-8, a mobile PCR machine, and this comes with a ready-made foot-to-mouth assay for use in the field. So we have used this along with our environmental samples. We do need to perform an RNA extraction. You cannot use these samples neat because it will inhibit the reaction. So it's not quite as straightforward as we'd like it to be, but you can do all of this in the field. So within a couple of hours of collecting your samples, you do have an answer as to whether there is foot-to-mouth present. Again, we really wanted to make the most of the samples and find out how much information we can actually get from these samples. As I mentioned, the environmental samples are quite low titers, so doing more within them than PCR detection is a little bit tricky. But we have managed to get VP1 sequence data from a couple of these samples. We had one farm in particular that had some quite acutely affected animals, so the samples that we collected from this farm had higher titers of virus than some of our other samples. And we handed these over to Gemma Wadsworth at Pirbright, and she managed to get VP1 sequence from one of these. And then Manna and Thatcher have worked quite hard again to produce more sequence data, so thank you to them. And the sequence then fitted in quite nicely with other samples that have been collected in this area, so it matched the circulating diseases. We've also applied these environmental sampling methods to goat markets. Obviously, movement of animals through markets is quite significant in terms of also movement of diseases. So from a surveillance perspective, sampling at markets is quite handy to find out what is actually going through the markets and what is circulating in the country. There is a poster on this, so I won't go too much into detail, but from the samples collected here, we did get positives for both foot-and-mouth and PPRV. But please see my poster for more details. So just to wrap up, I hope I have demonstrated to you that environmental sampling is a good way of detecting foot-and-mouth from the environment. We are in no way advocating that this replaces clinical sampling. Obviously, that is still a very good way of detecting foot-and-mouth, but this does give us the potential to detect foot-and-mouth outside of the arena of observing clinical signs. We get low viral titers compared to clinical samples, so characterization of samples is not always the most straightforward, but this does represent a low-tech, simple, and non-invasive sampling method, which I think is very valuable in terms of supplementing the current surveillance data that we have. So I'll just finish with some acknowledgements. All of our fieldwork was carried out alongside the EuFMD real-time training course in Nepal. So we're very thankful for them to helping with our fieldwork. That was all funded by the Government of Australia and facilitated by the Government of Nepal. So we have a lot of gratitude for them for actually being able to carry out this work. And just thanks to all of the people that Pirbright who have contributed to this work. Thank you very much for listening.